This is not speculation dressed up as analysis. This is the convergence of intercepted signals intelligence, commercial satellite anomalies, and diplomatic behavior so erratic that three separate Five Eyes partner agencies flagged it independently within the same 48-hour window. And it points to a conclusion so explosive that no government involved wants to publicly acknowledge it. The United Arab Emirates, host nation to approximately 3,500 U.S. military personnel, home to Al Dhafra, America's most strategically vital airbase in the entire Persian Gulf, may have deliberately compromised a live coalition strike operation to protect its own $30 billion annual trade corridor with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Let that satisfactorily settle in, because what you are about to hear does not just challenge the narrative of a surgical, successful American military campaign. It demolishes the foundational assumption upon which the entire U.S. forward-basing posture in the Middle East has been built for over 3 decades. The assumption that host nations are reliable partners. The assumption that shared enemies create permanent loyalty. The assumption that American military presence is so valuable that no rational actor would dare undermine it. Every single one of those assumptions died in the desert. And the old world, the world where the United States could project power from Allied soil without wondering if its secrets were leaking through the back door, that world is gone. What replaces it is something far more dangerous and far more honest. A world of transactional survival, where even your closest friends will sell your flight plans if the price is right. But the real shock was not the betrayal itself. It was how precisely the Iranians reacted to information they should never have possessed. In the 72 hours preceding the coalition's opening salvo, U.S. intelligence tracked a pattern of Iranian military activity that, at first, appeared to be routine defensive repositioning. Tehran had been on high alert for weeks. Movement of Mobile Transporter Erector Launchers, TELs, is standard procedure during periods of tension. The IRGC Aerospace Force regularly shuffles its Shahab-3 and Imad medium-range ballistic missiles between pre-surveyed launch sites to complicate targeting. American planners expected this. They had accounted for it. The entire strike architecture, built around Tomahawk Block 5 cruise missiles, JASM-ER standoff munitions, and precision GBU-39 small-diameter bombs, was designed to hit confirmed, fixed infrastructure, command nodes, underground storage bunkers, drone assembly facilities at Isfahan, and the IRGC Navy headquarters at Bandar Abbas. Mobile launchers were secondary targets to be prosecuted by loitering F-35s using real-time synthetic aperture radar. The plan was airtight, or it should have been. What American satellites observed instead was something profoundly different. Beginning roughly 60 hours before the first Tomahawk left its vertical launch cell aboard the USS Philippine Sea in the Gulf of Oman, Iranian forces didn't just move their TELs. They evacuated them from specific coordinates that precisely matched target sets contained in the coalition's classified Joint Prioritized Target List, the JPTL. Not approximately, not roughly, precisely. TELs were driven out of grid squares that had been designated as aim points only 72 hours earlier during a compartmented planning session at the Combined Air Operations Center, the CAOC, located at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. But here is the critical detail. The CAOC session included a small number of Emirati liaison officers who, under the bilateral intelligence sharing framework of the U.S.-UAE Defense Cooperation Agreement, had been granted access to portions of the target list as a routine courtesy to the host nation. A courtesy that may have cost the operation a significant portion of its strategic surprise. While the media ignored this, focusing instead on dramatic night vision footage of cruise missile launches and Pentagon press briefings celebrating the successful degradation of Iranian military infrastructure, a very different conversation was happening inside the National Security Agency's headquarters at Fort Meade, Maryland. NSA analysts, working in conjunction with their counterparts at Britain's Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ, had flagged an anomaly in communications intercepts collected from Oman's capital, Muscat. Specifically, a burst of encrypted traffic on a frequency associated with Oman's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a ministry that has served for decades as a quiet intermediary between Gulf Arab states and Iran. This traffic spike occurred at a timestamp that correlated almost exactly with the conclusion of the KAOK planning session. More damning still, GCHQ's Signals Analysis Division determined that the encryption protocol used in the Muscat transmission was not Omani military standard. It was a commercially available protocol previously identified in communications between Omani diplomatic contacts and Iran's Supreme National Security Council. The chain was circumstantial, but it was tightening. But while the world watched the fireballs light up the skies over Isfahan and Bandar Abbas, something far more sinister was happening in the diplomatic shadows behind the strike. Because the signals intelligence was only the first thread. The second came not from intercepted communications, but from commercial satellite imagery, the kind anyone with a subscription to Planet Labs or Maxar Technologies can access. And what those satellites revealed about Iranian force movements in the hours before impact was about to turn a suspicion into a crisis of alliance-level proportions. Open-source intelligence analysts, the kind who operate from laptop screens in Berlin, Taipei, and suburban Virginia, began publishing their findings within hours of the strike. And the pattern they uncovered was devastating. Maxar Technologies' Worldview 3 satellite, capturing imagery at 30-centimeter resolution, showed that at least 14 Iranian mobile TEL sites had been vacated between 36 and 48 hours before impact. Vacated cleanly, not hastily. The tire tracks in the desert hardpan showed orderly, single-file convoy departures. Equipment signatures, the thermal scarring left by missile fueling operations, had been carefully sanitized. These were not panicked retreats. These were planned, methodical evacuations executed by units that knew exactly which locations were compromised and exactly how much time they had to move. Planet Labs' SkySat constellation corroborated the Maxar findings. In one case, a cluster of 3 Shahab 3 TELs positioned near a hardened tunnel entrance in the Zagros mountain foothills was photographed at 0917 local time, fully operational, with support vehicles and security perimeters intact. 22 hours later, the same coordinates showed nothing but empty revetments and swept ground. The missiles, the launchers, the crews, gone. As if someone had whispered the exact grid reference and said, "You have 1 day." Moreover, the evacuation pattern was selective. That is the detail that transforms this from a story about good Iranian counterintelligence into a story about a specific, targeted leak. The Iranians did not empty every base. They did not execute a nationwide dispersal, which is what you would expect if Tehran had simply assessed, through its own analysis, that a strike was imminent and ordered a general stand to. Instead, they emptied 14 specific sites. 14 sites that matched entries on the coalition's JPTL, sites that were not publicly known, sites whose coordinates had been generated by classified U.S. national technical means, a euphemism for the combined output of signals intelligence satellites, synthetic aperture radar platforms, and human intelligence networks that represent the crown jewels of American collection capability. Someone with access to that list had passed it, wholly or in part, to the Iranians. And the circle of people with that access was terrifyingly small. This is where the investigation turned from signals intelligence and satellite imagery to something far more uncomfortable: human behavior. Within days of the strike, diplomatic reporting cables obtained by Bloomberg and later partially corroborated by Reuters painted a picture of Emirati conduct that was, to put it diplomatically, inconsistent with the behavior of a fully committed coalition partner. The UAE's ambassador to Oman had made 3 unscheduled visits to Muscat in the 10 days preceding the operation. 3 visits, each lasting less than 4 hours, each conducted without the prior notification to the U.S. Embassy in Abu Dhabi that is customary, though not legally required, under the diplomatic coordination framework governing coalition operations. When confronted informally by a senior American diplomat, the Emirati ambassador reportedly described the visits as related to bilateral trade discussions concerning a new free zone agreement. A plausible explanation, except that Oman's Ministry of Commerce confirmed no such negotiations were active during that period. The cover story had a hole in it, and Washington noticed. But here is where the calculus becomes truly cold. Because to understand why the UAE might risk the single most important military relationship in its national history, you have to understand what Abu Dhabi stands to lose on the other side of the ledger. The UAE-Iran trade corridor is not a minor economic footnote. It is a lifeline. Dubai's Port Jebel Ali and the older Creekside Dow wharves have served for decades as Iran's primary access point to the global economy, particularly during periods of maximum sanctions pressure. According to the International Monetary Fund's Direction of Trade Statistics, bilateral trade between the UAE and Iran has fluctuated between $15 and $30 billion annually over the past decade. Much of this flows through re-export schemes, goods imported into Dubai free zones, repackaged, relabeled, and shipped across the Gulf to Bandar Abbas and Bandar Lenge. Electronics, automotive parts, industrial machinery, and, according to U.S. Treasury Department enforcement actions, components with dual-use applications that occasionally find their way into Iranian military programs. This trade is not incidental to Dubai's economy. It is structural. Entire districts of Deira, the historic commercial heart of Dubai, operate almost exclusively on Iranian merchant capital. Thousands of Iranian-owned businesses are registered in UAE free zones. The Emirati banking sector processes billions in transactions annually that touch Iranian counterparties through layers of intermediary companies designed to maintain just enough legal distance from sanctioned entities. For Abu Dhabi, a full-scale U.S. war against Iran does not just mean a regional security crisis. It means economic cardiac arrest for significant portions of its own commercial infrastructure. They believe their strategic positioning, hosting American jets while quietly banking Iranian money, was invincible. They were wrong, and the price of that error was about to become visible on the most sensitive stage in global diplomacy, because the Americans were not going to let this slide. Within 72 hours of the strike's completion, a team from the Defense Intelligence Agency's Directorate of Analysis arrived at Al Dhafra under the cover of a routine post-operation assessment. Their actual mandate, according to 2 sources familiar with the deployment who spoke on condition of anonymity, was a counterintelligence review of information access protocols during the planning phase. They were there to trace the leak. Specifically, they carried authorization to audit the digital access logs of every non-U.S. personnel granted entry to the KAOX classified planning network during the 72-hour window preceding the strike. The audit's findings have not been publicly released, but the immediate policy consequences spoke volumes. Within 1 week, CENTCOM quietly downgraded the intelligence sharing classification tier for UAE liaison officers from SITK, Special Intelligence Talent Keyhole, the highest tier of signals and imagery intelligence, to No Foreign Adjacent, collateral level access. In plain language, the Emiratis went from seeing almost everything to seeing almost nothing, overnight, without a press conference, without a public accusation, just a silent, surgical severance of trust executed with the same precision as the strike itself. While the president spoke of unity at a Rose Garden press conference, praising the coalition's strength and citing the UAE by name as a valued partner, his closest allies in the intelligence community were already making a very different calculation, one that would reshape America's entire forward-basing strategy in the Gulf. Because the implications of this breach extended far beyond one operation. If a host nation could compromise a live target list, then every piece of intelligence shared at every American base on foreign soil was potentially vulnerable. Every classified briefing at Ramstein, every planning session at Kadena, every targeting cycle run through the Kayak at Al Udeid, the entire global architecture of U.S. power projection, an architecture built on the assumption that allies could be trusted with secrets, was suddenly, terrifyingly fragile. But the geopolitical earthquake was only beginning. Because Iran, emboldened by its miraculous survival and armed with the knowledge that cracks existed within the coalition, was about to make a move that no one in Washington had modeled. And it involved a phone call, not to Muscat, not to Abu Dhabi, but to Beijing. The call was placed at 4:47 a.m. Beijing time, on a secure line routed through Iran's embassy in the Chinese capital. On the Iranian end was Ali Shamkhani, the veteran national security operator who had served as Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council and retained deep personal channels into Chinese military and intelligence leadership. On the Chinese end, according to diplomatic sources who spoke to the Financial Times on condition of strict anonymity, was a senior official within the Central Military Commission's Joint Staff Department, the operational brain of the People's Liberation Army. The conversation lasted 41 minutes. And while its full contents remain classified at the highest levels of both governments, the diplomatic shockwaves it produced became visible within days. Because what Iran proposed, and what China apparently did not reject, was a fundamental restructuring of the security equation in the Persian Gulf. Tehran offered Beijing something it had sought for decades, but never been formally offered: permanent naval basing rights at Jask, a deepwater port on the Gulf of Oman's eastern shore, positioned just outside the Strait of Hormuz. In exchange, Iran requested two things. First, an emergency delivery of HQ-9B surface-to-air missile systems, China's most advanced exported air defense platform, roughly analogous to the Russian S-300 PMU-2, but with superior electronic countermeasure capabilities. Second, and far more consequentially, a public Chinese statement guaranteeing that any future unilateral military action against Iranian sovereign territory would be considered a threat to Chinese strategic interests in the region. The implications were staggering. A Chinese base at Jask would place PLA Navy vessels within direct observation range of every American carrier transit through the Strait of Hormuz. It would give Chinese intelligence services persistent, shore-based signals collection capability against the entire U.S. Fifth Fleet operational area. And it would create a tripwire, a physical Chinese military presence that any future American strike planner would have to account for, fundamentally altering the risk calculus of any operation against Iran. In strategic terms, it was the equivalent of placing a Chinese aircraft carrier permanently anchored in America's operational backyard. And it was made possible, in no small part, because a leak from an allied nation had demonstrated to Tehran that the American coalition was not the monolithic force it pretended to be. Cracks could be exploited, and the biggest exploiter of cracks on the planet had just been invited to step through. But the real shock was not China's interest. Beijing had been quietly expanding its Middle Eastern military footprint for years. The base in Djibouti, the port investments in Pakistan's Gwadar, the naval facility discussions with Oman. The real shock was the speed with which Gulf states that had been American security dependents for decades began to hedge. Within 96 hours of the first reports about the JASC proposal leaking through diplomatic channels, Saudi Arabia's Deputy Defense Minister, Prince Khalid bin Salman, made an unannounced visit to Beijing. The official Saudi readout described the trip as a discussion about Vision 2030 economic cooperation. But flight tracking data showed his aircraft landed at Zhuhai, home to China's premier defense exhibition and, more relevantly, to the headquarters of China Electronics Technology Group Corporation, the state-owned entity responsible for manufacturing the PLA's most advanced radar and electronic warfare systems. The Saudis were not shopping for economic partnerships. They were shopping for options. And the fact that they felt the need to shop at all told Washington everything it needed to know about the depth of the trust crisis unleashed by the UAE leak. Moreover, the dominoes did not stop in Riyadh. Qatar, already maintaining an independent channel to Tehran and hosting both the largest American airbase in the Middle East and a Hamas political bureau in the same capital city, began quietly renegotiating the terms of its Al Udeid basing agreement. Specifically, Doha requested a new clause granting the Qatari government advance veto authority over any offensive operations launched from its soil, a provision that, if accepted, would effectively give a foreign government the power to ground American bombers in the middle of a campaign. The Pentagon rejected the demand categorically, but the fact that it was made at all signaled a seismic shift in the power dynamic between the United States and its Gulf partners. The hosts were no longer grateful tenants offering free land to their protectors. They were landlords, suddenly aware of their leverage, suddenly willing to use it. There were only 90 minutes left in the Emergency National Security Council session, convened to address the cascading fallout, when the Director of National Intelligence presented the assessment that would reshape American strategy for a generation. The assessment was blunt. It stated, in language remarkable for its lack of bureaucratic hedging, that the United States could no longer treat Gulf basing access as a strategic constant. It recommended the immediate acceleration of 3 programs. First, the expansion of Diego Garcia's infrastructure in the Indian Ocean to serve as a fallback power projection hub outside the political reach of Gulf governments. Second, the rapid deployment of the Navy's expeditionary sea base platforms, essentially floating forward operating bases that require no host nation permission to operate. Third, and most provocatively, the initiation of a classified feasibility study for relocating CENTCOM's forward headquarters from its current positions in the Gulf to a location on sovereign U.S. territory, potentially Guam, or even a purpose-built facility on Wake Island. The message was unmistakable. If America's allies in the Gulf could not be trusted with its secrets, then America would remove itself from the need to share them. The era of dependent forward basing was ending. The era of sovereign standoff power projection was beginning. And yet the cruelest irony of all was this. The UAE's calculated betrayal, if that is indeed what it was, may ultimately have achieved the opposite of its intended effect. Abu Dhabi presumably leaked the strike coordinates to protect its economic relationship with Iran, to ensure that Tehran survived with enough military dignity intact to continue functioning as a trade partner, rather than collapsing into a failed state on its doorstep. A rational calculation, a cold calculation, but a calculation that failed to account for second-order consequences. Because by demonstrating that American secrets were not safe on Emirati soil, Abu Dhabi did not preserve stability. it detonated it. It gave Iran the confidence to invite China into the Gulf. It gave Saudi Arabia the justification to hedge toward Beijing. It gave Qatar the leverage to challenge American basing terms. And it gave Washington the one thing it needed to justify a strategic withdrawal it had been quietly contemplating for years. Proof that the old alliance model was broken beyond repair. The UAE did not save its position, it burned it. And in the ashes of that betrayal, a new Middle East is being constructed. One where American aircraft carriers no longer patrol as unchallenged sovereign entities. Where Chinese destroyers may soon dock alongside Iranian frigates at Jask. Where the price of oil is negotiated in 3 currencies instead of 1. And where the concept of a trusted ally has been replaced by something far more ancient and far more honest. The temporary alignment of interests, lasting only as long as the next phone call to Muscat. The Pentagon will never publicly confirm the UAE leak. There will be no congressional hearing. No ambassador will be expelled. The machinery of alliance management demands discretion. But the quiet restructuring of access protocols, the downgraded intelligence tiers, the sudden interest in floating bases and mid-ocean staging points, these are the receipts. These are the proof that behind the press conferences and the handshakes, a fundamental rupture has occurred. The United States trusted its closest Arab ally with the coordinates of a live combat operation. And those coordinates ended up in the hands of the enemy. That fact alone, regardless of the diplomatic euphemisms that will be wrapped around it, represents the single most consequential intelligence compromise in the history of U.S. Gulf relations. And its aftershocks will determine the architecture of Middle Eastern security for the next 50 years. Because here is the final truth that no analyst will say on camera, but every strategist in Washington now understands in their bones. The Middle East was never America's to lose. It was America's to rent. And the lease just expired. The bases will remain for now. The flags will still fly side by side at coalition exercises. The joint communiques will still use words like unbreakable and enduring. But the substance behind those words has evaporated like morning fog over the Persian Gulf. What remains is a transactional wasteland where every handshake conceals a hedge, every shared secret carries the risk of resale, and every ally is simultaneously a partner and a potential adversary. The skies over the Gulf no longer belong to any single power. They belong to whoever is willing to pay the most, in money, in missiles, or in betrayal, to claim them. And in that new world, the only truly safe base is the one that floats. The only truly secure communication is the one never shared. And the only truly reliable ally is the one you never have to trust at all.